shall we do tonight? Dress up, spend a lot of money?
Why not?
Welcome to episode 11 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we combine two films to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring two movies that play with our perceptions of reality. First up, we will be discussing independent British psychological thriller The Ghoul from 2016. And then after that, we are heading out to sea with Melissa George in Triangle from 2009 and from director Christopher Smith. And it's going to be rather difficult for me to say much more about them without giving everything away. So this week, rather unusually, I'm going to give spoiler warnings from the beginning for both movies and also for some of the others that we'll be discussing along the way. But before we do that, some corrections for some of the info that was given in episode 7, when we discussed the production of Village of the Damned from 1960. I'd like to thank writer Anthony McKay from Little Shop of Horrors magazine for reaching out with these. Anthony is the author of an article on the movie that you can find in issue 42 of Little Shop of Horrors, and his research certainly surpassed mine, so I'm going to read part of the message he sent to me verbatim. Quote, "There was no interference from the Catholic Church at any stage of the writing or production of this film. I've been through the studio paperwork, the production code documents, the Catholic League of Decency reports, and notes from the BBFC. The origins of the Catholic interference story seem to have come from Sterling Siliphant, who wrote the early screenplay for the film, but left MGM soon after the script was delivered, and had nothing to do with the film while MGM messed around, passing the film between different producers and screenwriters, before returning to Siliphant's original script. My personal opinion is that Siliphant was interviewed long after his involvement with the script, and he was scratching around for something to say. He was justifiably pissed off with the two British crew members who did a script editing job and were credited as writers. The British setting was retained in Siliphant's script and other writers' versions, and the shift to MGM's UK studios was due to budget, the availability of authentic locations, and the requirement of MGM's new production department for suitable double feature projects." End quote. The other area that he advised me of was in the dubbing of the character of David. The character was indeed dubbed, but I erroneously said that the dubbing was still done by the actor Martin Stevens, when in fact it turns out it wasn't. David's dialogue was really looped by voice artist Olive Gregg, and Anthony was able to confirm this through correspondence with a colleague of Gregg's and analysis of both actors' work on film. So thank you very much, Anthony, for the correction. Never let it be said that I won't hold my hands up when I get something wrong. I've gone back and re-edited the episode, but I wanted to make the correction clear here for any listeners who heard the original version. You can find Anthony's full article on Village of the Damned in Little Shop of Horrors issue 42. And while I'm on the subject, please also look out for their upcoming issue covering the British 1960s monster movie Gorgo, which I think is best described as a low-budget British King Kong Godzilla hybrid, and is kind of great if you like low-budget monster movies, which, to be fair, I do. I'll link their website in the show notes as well, but thank you, Anthony, once again. And now back to this week's episode and a fairly extensive spoiler warning. Across the entirety of this episode, there will be spoilers, to a lesser or greater degree, for the following films: Dead of Night from 1945, Last Year at Marienbad from 1961, La Jetée from 1962, the Twilight Zone episodes Judgment Night and Shadowplay from seasons 1 and 2, The Tenant from 1976, the Hammer House of Horror episode Rude Awakening from 1980, Lost Highway from 1997, Donnie Darko from 2001, Primer from 2004, and Time Crimes from 2007. There will also, of course, be very heavy spoilers for both Triangle and The Ghoul. So if you haven't seen them yet, The Ghoul is available for free on Tubi and also for rental on YouTube, while Triangle is available to watch on Plex and YouTube, and both are also, of course, available for rental on other popular streaming services. So, approach this week's episode with caution, or at the very least, with a finger on the skip button. And as always, before we begin, a quick mention to the main sources used in this episode, all of which will be listed in the show notes. For the discussion on The Ghoul, I have referred mainly to the documentary In the Loop that was included in the Arrow Video DVD release in 2018. I have also referred to interviews given by director Gareth Tunnelly and actors Tom Meaton and Alice Lowe that are available on the websites bfi.org.uk, screendaily.com and theartsdesk.com. For Triangle, I have referred to the director's commentary, an interview with Christopher Smith, and a behind-the-scenes documentary called The Making of Triangle, and these are all included on the Umbrella Entertainment Special Edition Blu-ray release. I've also referred to interviews that can be found on the websites sci-fi-now.co.uk, indielondon.co.uk, and comingsoon.net. And for both movies, I have also referred to a number of red carpet interviews and press Q&As that are available on YouTube, and again, these will be linked in the show notes. And now that we have gotten all of that out of the way, what we are talking about this week is time loop horror and mobius strip movies, of which The Ghoul and Triangle are but two examples. So, imagine taking a strip of paper, giving it a half twist, and then taping the ends together. What you will have made is a mobius strip, a surface with only one side and one edge. If you were to draw a line along it, you'd eventually return to where you started, having travelled both the top and the bottom of the loop without ever having to lift your pen. The strip is named after the German mathematician August Ferdinand Mobius, who discovered it in 1858. Although, to be fair, another German mathematician called Johann Benedict Listing also discovered it, independently, in the very same year. And as it turns out, it had already appeared in Roman mosaics as far back as the 3rd century, which does rather take all of the meaning out of the word discovery. While it began life in the world of mathematics, the Mobius strip has taken on a metaphorical meaning far beyond that. One popular thought experiment is to imagine an ant walking along the strip. At times it's upside down, at times it's on the inside, and then it's on the outside, but it never leaves the surface. It simply loops back to its starting point, endlessly circling the same journey. There's no exit, no real turning point, just continuous movement around a single twisted path. As such, it's a perfect image for stories about the distortion of time and where characters are trapped in loops that they can't understand or ever seem to escape. No wonder then that it has formed the basis for any number of entries in the horror and fantasy genres. To list them all here would take far too long, and I'm trying to keep the length of these episodes at least minimally under control, though some of you may find that hard to believe. And also, to be honest, while the metaphor has been used to great effect in many films and TV shows, it has, in my humble opinion, occasionally also been used as a cop-out when the writers of teen supernatural dramas couldn't really seem to think of anything original to do. So today I'm just going to talk about some of my favourites, including the ones that I feel have been the most influential, or have done something a little bit different with the idea. We're going to start off, albeit briefly, with a film that is often called the grandfather of British horror, and this is Dead of Night from 1945. This is an anthology movie from Ealing Studios, and was, as far as I can remember, the second, or maybe the third horror movie that I ever saw. The reason that I say briefly discuss is that we will be covering this film in much more detail a little later in the series as we head towards Christmas. Because in my head, at least, I think of it as being a Christmas movie. So you can imagine what the season of goodwill is like at my house. And now I am about to give away the ending. So, in accordance with the spoiler warning I gave you a few moments ago, you might want to skip ahead if you've never seen the movie. And that is the last time I'm going to give you a warning in this episode. Dead of Night, much like many other omnibus movies, consists of 5 separate stories that are linked by a narrative framing device. The most famous story in the film is probably one about a ventriloquist dummy, something that would go on to inspire later movies such as Devil Doll in 1964 and Magic in 1978. For many people though, including me, it is the wraparound story that really makes the film. This story follows an architect named Walter Craig, who arrives at a country house and realises he's met everyone there before, in one of his dreams. As the stories unfold, a creeping sense of déjà vu builds, until the film ends, rather nightmarishly, exactly where it began, and we're back at the very opening scene, leaving the protagonist caught in a trap from which he can never escape. The notion of watching a recurring dream or a recurring loop is a conceit that has been used many times since, but to my mind this remains one of the most effective, though a couple of episodes of the classic series The Twilight Zone do come a close second. The first of these is the episode Judgment Night. This was screened in 1959 as part of the first season, and tells the story of a man on a passenger ship, the SS Queen of Glasgow, during the Second World War. Much like Walter Craig, he starts to experience a sense of déjà vu, until he becomes convinced that the ship is about to be attacked. And much like Walter Craig, the more he tries to explain his predicament, the less people believe him. Sadly, and rather brutally for its 1959 TV airing date, the ship is indeed attacked by a German U-boat, and all those on board are killed. The twist, because after all this is the Twilight Zone and there has to be one, is that our hero is in fact the Nazi captain of the U-boat, and has been doomed by his actions to relive the destruction of the ship over and over again as a kind of eternal punishment. Much like Dead of Night, the story ends exactly as it began, with him standing on the deck of the ship and wondering who he is and how he got there. 2 years later, in 1961, the Season 2 episode Shadowplay would use a similar structure to tell the story of a man on death row, who insists to anyone that will listen that they are all figments of his imagination and are just characters in a recurring nightmare. Initially met with disbelief by the district attorney, who thinks that he's trying for an insanity plea to escape the electric chair, the prisoner gradually convinces him that he only believes himself to be real because he has been dreamed that way. Needless to say, the prisoner is executed at the end of his nightmare, and the other characters disappear. The loop is then reset back to the same scene that opened the episode. The recurring nightmare plot device would also be used some 20 years later in the story Rude Awakening from the 1980s Hammer House of Horror series. And let's be honest, it wouldn't be an episode of this show unless I mentioned that series at least once. British character actor Denham Elliott is in fine form here as an incredibly sleazy estate agent who wakes up from a nightmare in which he murders his wife, only to find the day playing out again and again and again. It's basically a horror riff on Groundhog Day, but without the laughs, unless you count the very 1980s clothing that adorns Lucy Gutteridge, who plays the secretarial girl of his dreams as variations on middle-aged male fantasy, until it is revealed at the climax that she is nothing of the sort at all. Also playing around with dream narratives, though in a much more oblique and abstract manner, is the 1961 art house movie Last Year at Marienbad. Now, to be honest, this isn't a horror film at all, but I mention it here because it's one of my favourites, and it's also a possible contender for the most beautiful film ever made, albeit a somewhat frustrating one. Directed by Alain Resnais and starring Delphine Seyrig and Giorgio Albertazzi, it is at once a filmic puzzle, a memory experiment, and an art house cinema wet dream. A man who we know only as X tries to persuade a woman, who we know only as A, that they met the year before in the corridors of a hotel, or possibly a sanatorium, either at Marienbad or Frederiksbad, or perhaps neither. Time folds and refolds in languid tracking shots and looping dialogue, in a film that asks, but never answers, many questions about the nature of memory, identity, and the individual concept of truth. It's not exactly a Mobius strip movie, nor is it really a movie about time slips, but its dreamlike narrative and emphasis on repetition means it deserves a place in this conversation, not least because of its influence on Christopher Smith when he was writing the film Triangle, though more on that a little bit later. Another influence on Smith, and more than a little influence on Terry Gilliam's 1995 sci-fi movie 12 Monkeys, was released a year later in 1962, and this is the film La Jetée, created by Chris Marker, a French writer, photographer, and documentary maker. It's a 28-minute film constructed entirely from still photographs, and tells the story of a soldier in a post-apocalyptic world who is sent back in time in an attempt to alter the past. Highly original, and also a masterclass in sound design and editing, it's quite rightly considered a masterpiece of French cinema, and a shining example of the so-called left bank movement, which also, coincidentally, included the aforementioned Alain Resnais. A more explicit Mobius strip story appeared in 1976 and also came from France, and this is The Tenant, directed by Roman Polanski and based on a 1964 novel by the surrealist Roland Topor. This movie tells the story of a mild-mannered man who moves into a Paris apartment block and slowly begins to unravel as he investigates the attempted suicide of the previous occupant. Becoming more and more obsessed, he even visits the previous tenant in hospital to find her completely wrapped in bandages and screaming at the sight of him. As his investigation continues, and the other occupants of his apartment building become more and more monstrous, the line between his own self and the previous tenant begins to blur, until he finds himself replicating her fall from a window and ends up in hospital, swaddled in bandages. In a Mobius strip climax, he is then visited by himself and screams uncontrollably as the cameras zoom in. This film is in many ways a very dark companion piece to Rosemary's Baby, and despite the heavyweight cast, which includes Isabelle Adjani, Shelley Winters and Melvyn Douglas, how you will feel about it depends on your position on Polanski, not least because he also plays the lead. A director who is probably far easier to get on board with, in my opinion, is David Lynch, who has frequently played around with time and repetition in many of his works, most notably Lost Highway in 1997. A film which appears to end in much the same way that it begins. Lost Highway is the story of a man, played by Bill Pullman, who is accused of murder. He then transforms into a completely different person, played by Balthazar Getty, living an entirely different life, until he slowly spirals back into the original story. The looping narrative has been likened to a Mobius strip by many, including Lynch himself in the film's press kit, saying that he discussed the mathematical concept with co-writer Barry Gifford during the scripting process. He later expanded on this, saying that the film is not so much a circle as a spiral, with each loop a little bit higher than the one that precedes it. Interestingly, He has also described the story as being about psychogenic fugue, a dissociative state characterized by amnesia, the assumption of a new identity, and unexpected travel or wandering. And it's worth bearing this definition in mind when we come on to talk about our two main features in just a moment. And finally, moving into the 21st century, we have three films that engage more explicitly with time loops and the doppelganger effect that they inevitably create. Donnie Darko in 2001 gave us Jake Gyllenhaal sleepwalking his way out of a rather bizarre accident, setting off a chain of increasingly surreal and destructive events involving time travel, predestination, mental instability, and giant rabbits called Frank. Primer in 2004 is a low-budget indie film from director Shane Carruth about two engineers who build a time machine and begin looping themselves into ever deeper paradoxes, gradually losing track of who they are and which version of events they're living through. Some viewers may find this film a little bit too wordy, especially during its very dense technical opening, which is probably not surprising, given that Carruth, a graduate with a degree in mathematics and also a former engineer, chose not to simplify any of the dialogue for the sake of the audience. Nevertheless, the film collected the Grand Jury Prize Dramatic at the 2004 Sundance Film Festival, and has also been rather influential on a subsequent generation of independent filmmakers, including Gareth Tunley, the director of The Ghoul. Then, in 2007, the Spanish sci-fi thriller Time Crimes, directed by Nacho Vigalondo, offered a slightly more accessible take on a similar theme. The film opens with our protagonist spotting something strange in the woods. When he goes to investigate, he's inadvertently drawn into a short but increasingly disturbing time loop, with every attempt to fix the situation only making it worse. It's a quite brilliant piece of science fiction horror, not least for the protagonist's dawning realization that the monster he's been running from is in fact himself. And that's something that we'll hear about again a little bit later. All of which brings me to our first film in this week's double bill, which is The Ghoul from 2016. This was written and directed by Gareth Tunley and stars Tom Meaton, Alice Lowe, Rufus Jones, Jeffrey McGivern, and Neve Cusack. So, as you will have gathered from the lead-in to this week's episode, The Ghoul is very much a Mobius strip movie, and this is something that is both acknowledged and then made explicit as the narrative progresses. The film begins as the story of Chris, a police detective who goes undercover as a psychotherapy patient to investigate a rather bizarre double murder. But as the therapy begins, both Chris and his sense of reality start to unravel, and a different personality begins to emerge. But then again, maybe that isn't what happens at all. This film actually has a fair amount in common with They Look Like People, which we discussed back in episode 9, not least because this is also a cinematic Trojan horse. Director Gareth Tunley wanted to make a movie exploring depression, but sensing that this would probably be rather a hard sell for cinema audiences, he decided to camouflage the subject matter beneath the surface of a psychological thriller. And also, like They Look Like People, this is an independently produced labour of love, shot on a micro-budget, largely self-financed by the director, and brought to life by a small circle of incredibly talented friends. One key difference, though, is that The Ghoul has its roots in a very different landscape, and that is the British stand-up comedy circuit of the early 2000s. If you're familiar with British comedy from the beginning of the millennium, you'll certainly recognise more than a few faces. Tom Meaton, who plays the lead Chris, has appeared in TV shows including The Mighty Boosh, Star Stories, The IT Crowd, Motherland, and Noel Fielding's luxury comedy. Alice Lowe is, of course, very well known for her cult comedy Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, as well as appearances in Little Britain, Black Books, and The IT Crowd, though horror fans will know her best from Sightseers in 2012, which she co-wrote, and Prevenge in 2016, which she wrote, directed and starred in. Rufus Jones also shows up, having featured in many of the previously mentioned shows, as well as the BBC spoof W1A. I also want to give a special mention for his collaborations with the gloriously bleak comedy writer Julia Davis, especially 2016's Camping, where he was extraordinarily good as the unravelling and desperate character Tom, and also for his series Home in 2019, which he created, wrote and starred in. Comedy fans will also notice Dan Renton Skinner, probably best known for his creation Angelus Epithemiou as the character Jim, and also Paul Kaye as Tommy, the drug dealer, who dominates the party sequence with his long and rambling story about lost money and the power of prayer. I could keep going, but the point is this. For a film as dark and serious as The Ghoul, the cast and crew were, in director Gareth Tunley's own words, a bunch of clowns. Most of them had known each other for years, having first crossed paths at the Edinburgh Festival, described by Alice Lowe as a place you go to every August if you want to work in comedy, and then you come back with no money, but several new drinking partners. Back in London, they continued performing together at a weekly sketch night called Ealing Live, which was staged at the old Ealing Film Studios, home of classic British cinema, and also, coincidentally, the birthplace of Dead of Night in 1945. It was here, incidentally, that Alice Lowe and fellow comedian Steve Oram developed the murderous couple who would go on to feature in the movie Sightseers, which was released in 2012 and directed by Ben Wheatley. Ben Wheatley, as I'm sure most listeners will know, would go on to become a leading figure in British genre cinema with films like Kill List, A Field in England and In the Earth, as well as working in mainstream Hollywood. He played a significant role in the making of The Ghoul, and not just as a producer. Gareth Tunley has described him as a galvanizing force, somebody who opened up brand new possibilities in filmmaking. The two first met when Wheatley was directing short-form comedy, and he later cast Tunley in his 2009 debut feature Down Terrace, which, incidentally, was actually shot not that far from where I'm recording this week's episode. Made on a micro-budget, Down Terrace has often been cited by Wheatley himself as a kind of template, a model for how independent films could be made with limited resources, and saying that if he could do it, anyone can. Although Tunley's role was small, for him this was not just an acting gig, it became an education in micro-budget filmmaking. Though it would also lead to him being cast in the role of the priest in Kill List in 2011, and he also, incidentally, appears in an uncredited role in Sightseers. By this point, Tunley had been writing scripts for years, sending them out with very little interest from producers. It soon became clear to him that if he wanted to make a film, no one was going to hand him the money, and he'd have to do it himself. He already had a story in mind, and a script already written, which was around 90 pages long, and he gave it to his Edinburgh and Ealing comedy friend Tom Meaton. Even then, he wasn't sure if Meaton, best known for his comic work and larger-than-life physical characters, would be right for the role, or indeed even interested in it. But they had already worked together on a short film called The Baron, and Tunley was keen to hear his friend's thoughts. Tom Meaton has since said that the screenplay took his breath away and pulled him into a world that was far removed from anything that he'd done before. Playing the lead in a serious drama was a challenge that he'd never faced, and having played mostly comic parts, he saw this as a chance to explore a darker and more complex character, and to work in a way that allowed for real psychological depth. The decision to co-produce the film with Tunley came very naturally, and also gave him the opportunity to help shape and refine the narrative. The pair went through the original script together, asking how much of it they could realistically make on the very limited budget that they had, and the answer they realised was very little. So the script had to be cut back rather drastically, and Tunley has said that the screenplay essentially emerged out of the budget, rather than the other way around. Meaton and Tunley started working with a third producer, another friend called Jack Healy-Goodall, and they all worked closely to shape a screenplay that was achievable within the confines of the money they had available, which largely came from Tunley savings and a small grant that they managed to obtain. On learning that their friends were making a film, Alice Lowe and Rufus Jones quickly came on board. Jones then suggested the actor Geoffrey McGivern for the role of Morland. The script also found its way to Niamh Cusack, who was intrigued by the opportunity to play the psychotherapist Helen Fisher, a character who initially seems like a positive force, but gradually becomes more malevolent. She later described the experience as being, quote, a bit like a kid playing at being a monster, end quote. As we've explored previously, the success of any micro-budget film, without special effects or big-name stars, lies in the depth and complexity of the narrative, and the strength of the characters and performances. And whilst the narrative in this film is indeed very gripping, more on that in a moment, it is the performances that really hold the attention. And, as it turns out, there was actually an unexpected advantage in casting comedy performers. There is, of course, a need for them to suppress their usual larger-than-life exaggerated performances, and that brings an unexpected intensity, particularly from Tom Meaton, who had a background in surreal and larger-than-life performances. This is, in fact, rather reminiscent of something that Pete Walker once said about casting sitcom actress Sheila Keith in his films House of Whipcord and Frightmare, both of which we discussed back in episode 3. Walker argued that comedy actors often made the best horror performers, and after watching Sheila Keith in those movies, and observing the performances in The Ghoul, I'm starting to agree. Tom Meaton has described playing Chris as particularly challenging, especially the need to temper his usual physicality and facial expressions. In comedy, everything tends to be external and bigger, but in this role he had to internalize his emotions and keep them just below the surface. His performance in the movie is one of pain and anguish, moving from the confident cop we meet in the opening to the shell of a man crushed by his own mental torment, a severe depression that he names the Ghoul. The scene where he is bullied in the stairwell is painful to watch, and marks a shift between Chris the cop and Chris the depressive. Equally gut-wrenching is the scene where he repeatedly ignores calls from a girl he meets at a party, choosing instead to get wasted and withdrawing further into his fantasy life. Happiness may be just within reach at the end of the phone, but he is incapable of grasping it. The blurring between fantasy and reality reminds me of the proverb about a man who dreams he's a butterfly, and then when he wakes, doesn't know whether he is now a butterfly dreaming that he is a man. In a voiceover conversation with his therapist, Chris tells her that he daydreams he is an undercover cop, and that while the fantasy is nice, he knows that it isn't real. But later, during the party sequence, which Meaton himself later described as the lamest party in history, an admittedly high partygoer asks him how he knows he's not really an undercover cop, just imagining that he's a normal person. For Tunley, the ambiguity means that the movie offers something new with each viewing, and that you can watch it multiple times and have a different experience. Having watched it several times myself now, I can confirm this to be true. Each viewing reveals something new or gives a slightly altered perspective, but what is never offered are any real solutions. One possibility is that Chris does indeed start as a police officer, and under the influence of the two antagonists, gradually morphs into another character suffering from mental illness. After all, his character only shifts after the initial session with Fisher, suggesting that it might be some form of trigger. Alternatively, he could genuinely be a patient, one that Fisher and Morland have been manipulating all along for their own magical purposes. And then there is a third option, that he is in fact neither of these things, but is instead a very troubled man living a fantasy life, and the more fantastic elements of the movie are all just within his head. This possibility is certainly highlighted by Fisher, as she advises, quote, "People who suffer from depression often believe they've always felt this way, like they're trapped in a circle," end quote. The ambiguity of the narrative, and the refusal to explain anything at all, is something that some will find polarizing, if not frustrating, and some critics at the time of the movie's release were very quick to mention this, finding it too opaque, and as a result somewhat distancing. The horror fan in me, of course, wants to believe that there is some strange occult conspiracy afoot, and that is the reading that I most often lean into. But I suspect that my bias for modern supernatural narratives has a tendency to cloud my judgment, not unlike Chris as the movie progresses. Alice Lowe, who plays the character Kathleen, appreciates the duality and said in an interview, quote, "You can sort of watch it and choose. You can choose to believe that the character's mad, or you can choose to believe in the witchcraft element. It's a nice metaphysical little conundrum." End quote. One other possibility is that by the end of the film, Chris is experiencing a psychotic break, and in fact kills Fisher and Morland after breaking into their home. Everything that occurs after that is in fact a psychogenic fugue, and the splitting of the motorway as he makes his escape represents the splitting of his personality, allowing him to flee the reality of his guilt and crime by creating an entirely new life for himself within his own imagination. The psychogenic fugue is of course something we mentioned earlier when discussing Lost Highway, and it is not the only similarity, with the opening and closing shots of a motorway at night a feature in both films. Tunley says that this was unintentional, although it may have been subconscious, and as he is very open in his discussion of his references, there is no reason to not believe him. He has mentioned taking some inspiration from Lynch in terms of music, most notably the score for Mulholland Drive, as well as the work that Ennio Morricone did for Sergio Leone. Other references include Peter Ackroyd's novel Hawksmoor, which is an occult-flavoured noir thriller telling parallel stories across two different time periods, and also the novel City of Glass by Paul Auster, which also concerns a detective that loses his sense of identity. Cinematic inspirations for the Ghoul include the film Primer, which we discussed earlier, as well as Christopher Nolan's debut feature Following from 1998. Tunley has also said that he was inspired far more consciously by the film Rosemary's Baby, of which he says, quote, "You can either engage with it as a portrait of mental breakdown or as a tale of supernatural manipulation, and that's the balance we were aspiring to with the Ghoul." End quote. Personally, if I was going to compare this film with Polanski, I would opt more for The Tenant, which we also discussed earlier. For me, Rosemary's Baby is a pretty straightforward narrative, as well as being, in author Ira Levin's own words, a pretty dark joke about the dangers of marrying outside of one's own religion. Alongside Tom Meaton, the film is enlivened by the performance of Rufus Jones as the dubious property manager Coulson, another contender for the Ghoul of the title, and where I thought the film was going on my first watch. His character reportedly hangs around criminals and crime scenes, potentially talking people into acting horrifically on his behalf. Jones brings a raw, unpredictable energy to his performance. His first interaction with Chris, where he says, "Buy me a coffee or I'm calling the police," before flashing an incredibly fake smile, is full of genuine menace and unpredictability, and Jones captures the character's volatile nature perfectly, with the smile becoming more and more unnerving as the movie progresses. Jeffrey McGivern plays Morland, the therapist into quote-unquote weird shit, and he's a veteran actor known from radio comedy such as The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He is equally as unnerving as Rufus Jones, though in a very different way. Whilst Coulson seems untethered and capable of switching from friend to enemy at the drop of a hat, Morland seems to hide behind a jovial exterior, initially greeting Chris at his front door with rather bumbling inanities. But, as the film progresses, he seems to be grooming his client for something, even if we are unsure of exactly what that might be. Again, this could be pure paranoia from Chris's perspective, but the references to chaos magic, Dr. John Dee, sigils and Klein bottles are hardly your average therapist speak. He is also, of course, the mouthpiece for the film's narrative structure, explicitly discussing the concept of the Mobius strip and foreshadowing Chris's fate. The looping structure of the story is also depicted in the artwork on his office wall, as well as the spiral scratched into a train window and an eternity loop that is pinned to the wall in Coulson's apartment. There is a theory in much magical practice that one must believe in order for rituals to have an effect, and one wonders whether this is Morland's motivation in the movie, dragging Chris further and further along a line of belief until he is primed and ready to seal the time loop that has been the therapist's intention all along. If you want to believe in that storyline, of course. The rest of the cast are equally as effective, and Alice Lowe in particular brings a warmth to her performance as Kathleen, transitioning from potential fantasy profiler to nursery school teacher. Like Meaton, she was very impressed with Tunley's vision, saying that she was also blown away by the script and the way that it conveyed very complex ideas in a very clear manner. When it came to filming, it was all about maximising every location and stretching every setting to its full potential, embracing the kind of off-the-cuff guerrilla filmmaking we've discussed several times over the course of this series. The director of photography, Ben Pritchard, recalls art directing just to the very edge of each frame, as well as filming some of the more fluid tracking shots by balancing backwards in an adapted wheelchair. Much of the film was shot in producer Jack Healy-Goodall's family home while his parents were away on a trip. Even though the story suggests entirely different locations, many of them were all captured in the same building, one character's kitchen being shot just down the hall from another character's study. The same went for Tom Meaton's real flat in Hackney. The party scene used his bedroom, the exterior also doubled as the outside of Kathleen and Dan's flat, and many of the film's cityscape cutaways were filmed from the top of that same building. What's particularly striking about The Ghoul is its portrayal of London. This isn't the familiar city of tourist attractions or the glossy postcard version we most often see in films. There are no shots of Big Ben, or the Houses of Parliament, or iconic red buses. Instead, we're presented with narrow alleyways, graffiti-covered walls, underpasses, cranes on the skyline, and high-rise buildings. It's a version of London that many filmmakers pretend doesn't exist, but for those who live in the city, it's all too familiar. In a way, London itself almost becomes a third character in the film, shaping the tone and atmosphere in a subtle but very powerful way. Tunley and Meaton have joked that people have often asked them how they made London look so bleak and hellish, when in reality, it was just where they were living, in the London borough of Hackney. The film's colour grading also contributes to this, with a muted, slightly dreary palette of grey skies and subdued colours, which is no small accomplishment, given that Ben Pritchard recalls the entire film appearing pink when they reviewed the dailies. The principal photography, which covered the bulk of the dialogue scenes, was completed in just 10 days, followed by 4 days of pickups. Tom Meaton recalls seeing a rough edit of the film before the pickups had been shot and feeling quite terrified by what they had, or rather hadn't, been able to create. Those pickup days, he remembered, felt far more organic, as they worked closely with Pritchard to refine and shape the material they needed. They also found incredibly inventive ways to problem solve, and have been quite open about their DIY approach to special effects. The climactic car crash sequence was shot not on location, but in a garage in Twickenham, Middlesex, with crew members standing behind the stationary car holding torches, while Tom Meaton performed his driving acting from the front seat. Other scenes from the screenplay were cut entirely. The crime scene at the start of the movie was originally intended to be a much larger affair, with CSI staff and forensics teams, but this would, of course, have been far too expensive. Principal photography began in March 2014, but the film wouldn't be released for another 2 years, which is an indication of just how long post-production became. Much of the editing and sound mixing was done on laptops and borrowed equipment, and was carried out at weekends and in the evenings, as people held down their day jobs. They also faced numerous false starts and technical setbacks, particularly when preparing the film for cinema exhibition, and although there were no expensive visual effects to manage, balancing the dual narratives and maintaining the intended ambiguity was a real challenge in the editing suite. But this process also added new layers to the story, with Tunley realising, partly in the edit, how vulnerable and impressionable the character of Chris really was. The film's synthesizer-based score, with its echoes of Celestia and bells, was composed by Wayne Shepherd, who was, of course, another collaborator from the comedy world. Because it was delivered early in the post-production process, it allowed Tunley to edit scenes in sync with the music's rhythm. One notable example is the climactic driving sequence, which was reworked and expanded alongside the soundtrack to create something that was far more impressionistic. And while the final sound quality might not be as polished as a Hollywood production, which is completely understandable given the limited resources, the haunting soundscape of droning synths, distant traffic, and eerie whispers also helps to create an incredibly unsettling atmosphere. By mid-2015, Tunley described the project as being in the late stages of post-production, though in reality it wouldn't be fully completed until 2016. Once they had a complete cut, they brought in Diraj Mahey as an executive producer, and he made a significant contribution to the film's success because he actually got it seen, something that's far more difficult than it might first sound. He spent about 18 months screening the movie to key industry figures, carefully positioning it and helping the audience see its potential. And we have to remember, this was nearly 10 years ago, before the explosion of YouTube as a platform for filmmakers, and really before social media became the dominant distribution and marketing tool that it is today. The team started by organising small industry screenings for friends and contacts, slowly building buzz through word of mouth. That momentum eventually led to the film being accepted into the 2016 BFI London Film Festival, and this generated a lot of buzz and opened the door at other festivals. The film earned critical accolades, including nominations for the BFIA Discovery Award and a BAFTA nomination for Outstanding Debut by a British writer, director or producer. On the festival circuit, it gained predominantly positive reviews, with critics praising its atmosphere and ambition, especially considering its micro-budget. Critics from The Observer highlighted Gareth Tunley's resourcefulness in creating a complex psychological thriller with minimal resources, and The Hollywood Reporter acknowledged the film's macabre mood. However, some critics, like Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian, found the film frustrating due to its cryptic nature, and called it exasperating. Despite this, the Ghoul received praise for its performances, particularly Tom Meaton and Geoffrey McGivern. The film's atmosphere and bleak depiction of London were also praised, with favourable comparisons to film noir and Mike Leigh's 1993 movie Naked. The Ghoul grossed around $18,500 globally, with most of this coming from international markets. Its true reach was gained through home video and digital platforms, with Arrow Films releasing a special edition DVD loaded with extras, including a 36-minute documentary, which, as I mentioned at the top of the show, helped me research this episode. It was also broadcast on Film 4 in mid-2018, increasing its exposure to a late-night TV audience, which is possibly the ideal time to watch it. Right now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, it's currently available to watch for free on Tubi. Audience reception was rather more divided due to its slow-burn cerebral nature and its refusal to answer any questions. As I've mentioned, I've seen it several times now, most notably 3 times in a row the other night just to prepare for this episode, and I've changed my mind about what is happening every time. Is it an occult drama? Is it about a psychogenic fugue? Or is it something different altogether? To be honest with you, I've no idea, and even as I've recorded this episode, I've changed my mind about the outcome of the movie. Much like an ink blot test, the ambiguity of the film is open to interpretation, and whatever you end up with probably says as much about you as it does about the people who made the movie. In the same year that The Ghoul was released, Alice Lowe also released her directorial debut feature Prevenge, and the two films played at many of the same festivals. She followed its success with roles in Bandersnatch, Sometimes Always Never, Dark Encounter, and Inside Number 9, and continues to write and direct, including her second feature Time Stalker, which was released in 2024, and also featured a performance from Dan Renton Skinner. Rufus Jones created and starred in Home for Channel 4 television in 2019, which blended comedy with social commentary, and he's appeared in a plethora of TV shows and movies, including the films Stan and Ollie, Silent Night, as well as the incredibly popular and award-winning TV drama Rivals in 2024. Tom Meaton, praised for his intense lead performance, went on to appear in Alice Lowe's Prevenge, and also Motherland, Double Dates, and Paul Dodd's Deadly Lunch Break. He starred in the 2021 crime drama series Intruder, and, let's not forget, he also was BAFTA nominated as a producer for The Ghoul. He continues to focus on acting, usually somewhere between comedy and the uncanny. Following The Ghoul, director Gareth Tunley moved into TV, directing The Last SARS for Netflix, Intruder for Channel 5, and True Horror for Channel 4, as well as winning a children's BAFTA for Creeped Out. According to the Internet Movie Database, he is currently in pre-production on a new film. Given what he achieved with the micro-budget of The Ghoul and the support of a talented group of friends, I look forward to seeing whatever he delivers next. And this brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Triangle. This was released in 2009 and was written and directed by Christopher Smith. It stars Melissa George, Michael Dorman, Rachel Carpani, Emma Lung, and Liam Hemsworth. Christopher Smith first came to the public's attention with his debut feature film Creep, which was released in 2004, and which followed in the footsteps of Deathline and American Werewolf in London in establishing the London Underground as a place of horror. This very successful debut led to a career in directing horror movies, of which Triangle is the third. Strangely enough, however, even though he has always been a fan of the genre, he never really set out to be a horror film director. On graduating from film school, he tried to break into the film industry with a thriller, something that he has compared with David Mamet, but he found that the story was generating little to no interest. It was actually Neil Marshall, the director of Dog Soldiers and The Descent, who suggested that he instead try to write a horror movie, and this led to the creation of Creep, which, in a very roundabout way, also gave the inspiration for this week's movie. The idea for Triangle first emerged when Smith and his producer Jason Newmark were at the Cannes Film Festival with Creep in 2004. Sitting on the beach, they noticed an ocean liner in the distance, and Newmark suggested it would be a good setting for a film, as it would require a larger budget and more funding, and could therefore take their work to the next level. Smith immediately envisioned a story in which a woman boards a liner and sees someone watching her from an upper deck. And then, as the narrative unfolds, she finds herself on the upper deck, looking down and watching herself arrive. And this image became the seed from which the film would develop. While Smith has said that he can't pinpoint an exact single source of inspiration, he has acknowledged the influence of La Jetée and Last Year Marienbad, two films that we have already mentioned and which he greatly admires. He's also mentioned the closing sequence of Back to the Future as contributing to the idea of a character observing themselves from an altered perspective, as well as, of course, various episodes of The Twilight Zone. Wanting to take the initial concept a stage further, he also decided to construct a story in which the protagonist ultimately becomes the antagonist, a structural transformation that would become central to the film's design. That being said, he has described the ideas as very difficult ones to put into practice. Writing the screenplay, with its cycle of time loops and multiple character iterations, became something of an all-consuming challenge, made even more complicated by the transition of Jess from hero to villain. He has said that it almost put him on his back and turned into something of an obsession, particularly ensuring that the story couldn't be unravelled, as he was, quite rightly, certain that people would attempt to do that. For him, the structure had to be completely bulletproof, and the internal logic of the film had to be airtight and consistent with the universe that he was constructing. He was also very excited by the notion of a film ending in exactly the same place that it begins, something that he had never seen before, until a friend advised him to watch Dead of Night. Although he was impressed by the 1945 movie, and who wouldn't be, he realised that what he was attempting was going to be something completely different. Adding to the complexity of script writing was an unexpected interruption. Midway through writing the screenplay, he was offered the opportunity to direct his second feature, the horror satire Severance. Although it temporarily halted work on Triangle, the success of Severance proved highly fortuitous. Its critical and commercial reception helped him to secure the financing for this movie, which would become his most ambitious project to date, not just in terms of scale and budget, but also in terms of complexity and subtext. As with The Ghoul, where the looped structure reflects the cyclical nature of depression, the time loop in Triangle functions as more than just a narrative device. For Smith, it represents a state of psychological entrapment, being stuck inside your own mind and obsessively and endlessly reliving past mistakes. At its core, the film is about regret and the inability to undo something that has gone deeply, deeply wrong. In Jess's case, her remorse is so overwhelming that it transcends both death and time. Triangle becomes a meditation on confronting the reality of one's own actions, recognizing the person that you become, and being powerless to change it. And, as with The Ghoul, there are, of course, other possibilities to that, one of which is that Jess is experiencing psychosis or, indeed, a psychogenic fugue, something that Smith researched in writing the screenplay. Much like in Kubrick's The Shining, a film that Smith both admires and homages throughout the movie, it is entirely possible that everything is in Jess's imagination, with the winding corridors of the liner Aeolus representing the labyrinth of Jess's mind. Interestingly enough, after the film's release, Smith recounts that a viewer told him that Triangle closely reflected the psychological experience of a breakdown, particularly the idea of becoming a detached observer of one's own actions. He said that this wasn't something that he had set out to portray consciously, but rather it had emerged organically during the writing process. Stanley Kubrick and The Shining are referenced throughout, not least in the inclusion of the deserted ballroom, Room 237, and the endless corridors down which the characters become lost. As Smith was developing the screenplay, he realised that there were numerous similarities between his vision and Kubrick's movie, and he spent some time studying what had inspired the legendary director to work in the horror genre. In his research, he discovered that Kubrick had taken much inspiration from an essay by Freud on the uncanny, particularly the idea of twins and doppelgangers, and this also found its way into Smith's narrative. And interestingly enough, Freud's work on the uncanny was also the foundation for the movie Possum in 2018, which we discussed back in episode 3, and which also features a character endlessly looping around in their own head, though perhaps in a more metaphorical manner than we see here. Including the 1.5-year break where he was making Severance, the writing process for Triangle took nearly 4 years. But once it was complete, it attracted co-financing from Icon Entertainment, the UK Film Council, and also some Australian partners. The role of Jess is crucial to the film's success, particularly given that Smith wanted the viewer to feel empathy for her, despite her journey from victim to killer. US financiers offered up a short list of well-known actresses, and Smith even recalls Julia Roberts being mentioned at one point, which, on reflection, seems somewhat of a strange choice. However, Smith had another idea in mind, and this was Melissa George, an Australian actress who had impressed him with her performance in the TV series In Treatment. This 2008 HBO series followed a psychotherapist played by Gabriel Byrne and the weekly sessions with his patients, one of which was played by George. Giving an incredibly complex, nuanced and raw performance, she was nominated for a Golden Globe Award and had also delivered the exact level of intensity that Smith was after for Jess. She also had what he called a very real quality, something that he thought audiences could identify with, and not just a quote-unquote superstar running around on a boat. As well as her performance in Treatment and several other American TV series, George had actually been somewhat of a scream queen in the early 2000s, appearing alongside Ryan Reynolds in the remake of the Amityville Horror in 2005, the Tourists in Danger drama Touristas in 2006, and both W Delta Z and 30 Days of Night in 2007. She was interested in returning to the horror genre, but more than anything, she was fascinated by the script, calling it, at the time at least, one of the most challenging roles of her career. Viewing it as an opportunity to get her teeth into what she called a really hard performance piece, she has described the story as being about the demise and breakdown of a mother, and has highlighted the complexity of playing the various levels of insanity and identity. For her, the questions are whether Jess is a woman trying to get rid of the bad part of herself, and whether it's all in her mind, and indeed whether she is actually on a ship at all. Though the film is set off the coast of Florida, shooting took place in Australia, largely due to the Australian funding, but also for budgetary considerations. As a result, the cast all hail from the Southern Hemisphere, including Michael Dorham, a New Zealand actor who plays Greg, and Australian actors Rachel Carpani and Henry Nixon, who play the not very happily married couple Sally and Downey. Downey and Sally provide a much-needed degree of comic levity to the piece, at least in the initial stages, but Sally also provides one of the most shocking and memorable moments as she stumbles to her death amongst what appear to be dozens of other versions of her dying body. And this, perhaps bizarrely, is my favourite moment in the film. Also joining the cast is a very young Liam Hemsworth, just starting out in his career, and he was literally cast the day before filming began. And I have to say, it's really interesting to see his interviews at the time, where he is quite clearly blown away by the opportunity and speaks excitedly about arriving at the studios. Equally ironic is seeing one of the producers suggesting that he is going to go a very long way in a short space of time, and that if she put money on his success, she would be able to finance her next movie. So let's hope she did. The imagery of the film is deliberately dreamlike and surreal, and while some of the digital effects might have aged a little, in my mind this only adds to the dreamlike quality of the narrative. For example, the ship emerging out of a hazy sunshine, which is, even all these years later, still an impressive moment. Working with cinematographer Robert Humphries, Smith went out of his way to avoid the dark and moody cliches that are so common in horror, opting for terror in bright sunshine with bright and hazy exteriors, and some incredible use of colour, with reds and yellows that simultaneously appear both natural and also expressionistic, all of which of course contrast with the dark labyrinthian corridors within the boat. While we're talking about labyrinths, we should probably give a nod to the Greek mythology that is raised in the film, and that's something that I seem to be talking about more and more in every episode. The Aeolus is named after the Keeper of Winds, a character that appears in Homer's Odyssey, and who provides Odysseus with a bag of all the winds to help him find his way home. Unfortunately, the crew of the ship, thinking that the bag contained treasure, opened it before they reached home, and were driven off course, essentially trapped by their own actions in a journey that became never-ending. Also referenced is the story of Sisyphus, who committed various crimes against the gods, and also attempted to cheat death. His eventual punishment was to spend eternity pushing an immense boulder up a steep hill, only for it to always roll back down again. It is from this story that we gain the term Sisyphean task, meaning something that is both laborious and futile, and that is impossible to complete due to its very nature. This, of course, signposts not only the futility of Jess's attempts to rewrite history, but also foreshadows the end of the film, with the taxi driver, possibly Death himself, making a bargain with Jess that we know she cannot keep, thus dooming her to an eternity of torment. Though, as I've said repeatedly through this episode, and in relation to both movies, that's just one way of looking at it. What makes the film incredibly rewarding for me is that it's full of references and imagery that only reveal themselves on repeat viewings, second, third, or even fourth time around. The upturned toy boat that Jess lifts from the paddling pool in the opening credits is a subtle piece of foreshadowing for the real yacht, Triangle, which later capsizes in the storm. And it's not just symbolic. The expression on Jess's face as she lifts it seems tinged with recognition, or déjà vu. And this raises an unsettling question. Which version of Jess are we watching? According to Melissa George, there are 5, though Smith says in interviews that there are actually far more in the screenplay. The multiple versions of the character is something that is reflected quite literally in a series of mirrors as Jess and Greg first explore the ship in what Smith calls the first loop, or the first that the viewers are aware of at least. It's also reflected in the breathtaking moment when the camera seems to pass through a mirror as the first loop finishes and the story resets. The sound design also adds to these effects, with droning engines, distant thunder, squawking gulls, and creaking metal blending into a kind of ambient dread, aided immensely by the score from Christian Henson, who had previously worked with Smith on Severance and who would go on to work with him again on his subsequent movie, Black Death. What's particularly startling about the film, on first viewing at least, is the way that Smith subverts the slasher genre, a genre which one might easily be fooled into thinking that this film is a part of. It's very surprising for a film of this nature to kill off all of its characters, bar the nominal heroine, within the first 30 minutes, and I recall being completely thrown as to where the film was going when this happened. The slasher motif is carried through into the outfit that one of the versions of Jess is clothed in. The boiler suit is a clear nod to Michael Myers, while the sacking mask is a throwback to Jason Voorhees of Friday the 13th Part 2. And whilst we are on the subject of the sack-masked killer, there have been many who have commented on the similarities between Triangle and the Spanish film Time Crimes that we mentioned in the lead-in, not least in the multiple time loops and the cloth masking, or bandages, that the antagonist wears in both films. Unlikely as this may seem, the similarities between the two films are entirely coincidental. Smith was already writing his script as Time Crimes went into pre-production. There were also, at the same time, a number of films that played around with the concept of time, which is probably not surprising given that this was the turn of the new millennium. Smith himself has spoken on this in an interview with Bloody Disgusting, saying, quote, "At roughly the same time, there was Triangle, Time Crimes, Moon, and Primer, slightly before, but similar, all of which deal with the idea of looking back at yourself. It's the zeitgeist, I suppose. Filmmakers responding to the news and culture around them and asking themselves, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and feeding this into their work." End quote. This idea of questioning identity and of challenging the traditional notions of heroism and villainy was something that was very much in the air at the time. The West had gone to war in the Middle East, and there were growing concerns about the moral position taken by the US and Britain. Both nations cast themselves as heroes whilst pursuing regime change based on incredibly flimsy evidence of weapons of mass destruction. The question isn't just who are we really, it's whether, in our efforts to fight monsters, we had become the monsters ourselves. This is certainly something that Smith has considered retrospectively as being a subconscious thought in his mind when he was creating a character that would morph from victim to villain. Filming for Triangle ran for approximately 9 weeks, with principal photography taking place on Australia's Gold Coast as a stand-in for Florida. With much of the action taking place in studio sets, the team also used a real decommissioned warship, giving a level of detail to interiors that would otherwise have been impossible within their budget. The soundstage approach also allowed Smith and production designer Melinda Doring to create a visual homage to The Shining, with the ship's eerie Art Deco interiors, dimly lit symmetrical corridors, creating a sense of claustrophobia. If the scriptwriting and filming were a challenge, not least for Melissa George, who had to switch from one version of Jess to another, then editing it was something else altogether, and this task fell to editor Stuart Gazzard. Critics have singled out the editing as one of the film's standout achievements, calling it remarkable that the deeply complicated plots feel clear and comprehensible. The transitions between the various loops and various versions of the character are all extremely well done, allowing the viewer to keep their bearings whilst building tension and also allowing for constant surprise as the narrative progresses. Triangle premiered at London's Fright Fest on the 27th of August 2009 and opened theatrically in the UK on the 16th of October in the same year. Internationally, it played a handful of festivals, including Sitges in 2010, but never received a wide global cinema release. Critics were largely positive, with Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian describing it as a smart, supernatural time-shift chiller that genuinely created real shivers. Many reviewers praised the ingenuity of its time loop narrative and also Melissa George's very committed performance. However, UK box office returns were modest, and international theatrical exposure was limited. In the United States, it went straight to video in early 2010. And I'm sure that regular listeners can guess what I'm going to say next, because I literally say this every week. So perhaps I should leave it to Christopher Smith, who has said, quote, "It's my best reviewed film, I think, and I'm glad to say it's found its place in the zeitgeist. I came off the back of this thinking that I had made a remarkable film, and it got some great reviews. It's a strange thing, then, that the film found its audience through DVDs, and through the internet, and through downloads. It's now the most watched of my movies, and people still watch it. It's not dated. And in fact, I've made films since that are B-sides to Triangle. I'm still fascinated by what I tried to do there." End quote. Since its release, Christopher Smith has continued to work in the horror genre, though he has taken a few detours along the way. In 2010, he released Black Death, which was a Plague-era horror starring Sean Bean and Eddie Redmayne, which he remarkably followed up in 2014 with a family Christmas film called Get Santa, which starred Jim Broadbent as a very dishevelled St. Nicholas. In 2016, he released a film called Detour, a neo-noir thriller in the style of the early Coen brothers, but more recently, he's returned to the horror genre with The Banishing in 2020 and Consecration in 2023. As well as his cinema work, he's also directed for television, including episodes of Labyrinth and Alex Rider. And in 2024, he directed the British TV series Video Nasty, a highly enjoyable homage to the 1980s Video Nasty debacle and the films on which it was built. It's currently available to watch on the BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK, and I really enjoyed it, not least because it reminded me very much of my own misspent teenage years in the video shop. More recently, it was announced that he was working on a horror comedy called Spider Island, in which social media influencers are trapped on a tropical island with deadly spiders. And he's then going to follow this with a reboot of his debut feature, Creep. This will be titled The Creep and is set for a release in 2026. Of this project, he says, quote, "Ever since I finished Creep and released it to the world, I've wanted to return to that story. I've always felt that there was unfinished business. Whilst I've always loved the purity of what I achieved in my first film, I know that there is a scarier, more evolved film still inside me." End quote. So, here's hoping that this loop back in time is far more fruitful and happier than the ones that he gave the friends aboard the ship Aeolus. The Ghoul and Triangle are of course both examples of the Mobius strip movie, offering narratives that fold back on themselves with no fixed beginning and no stable end. Both movies trap their protagonists in a closed circuit of repetition and uncertainty, leaving you as the viewer to work out their true meaning, if indeed that is at all possible. Christopher Smith has said that, whilst there may not be a logical answer to his movie, there is certainly one emotional truth, and this could easily apply to Tunley's film as well. Whether an exploration of guilt or remorse, or an examination of the looping nature of depression, both films use the trappings of genre to depict a horror that comes from within, and also play with the idea of psychogenic fugue, not just as a medical term, but as a metaphor for human experience. In the end, we're not really sure if these stories are really happening, or if they're just in the minds of the protagonist. Ultimately, both movies act as puzzle boxes, beautiful to look at, mysterious and opaque. The enjoyment lies not in having a neat, tidy solution, but in the attempts to unravel the clues. And whether you find that frustrating or intriguing is very much up to you. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe because it really helps out in beating that damned algorithm. And please also consider following us on our Instagram, the Horror Double Bill, for trailers, photos and much more. And if you have any opinions on this week's films and what they mean, or indeed any of the films discussed so far in the series, I would love to hear from you, and you can email me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. So, it's occurred to me that over the last few weeks we've stayed very much in the 21st century, and also that we've ended up in some very, very dark movies. So, with next week's pairing, I'm going to go back to the 1900s, and I'm also going to lighten the tone a bit. Well, at least with the first movie, anyway. So, next week, we are going to explore the horrors of the old dark house, beginning with the 1939 horror comedy The Cat and the Canary, which stars Bob Hope, Paulette Goddard, George Zucco, and Gail Sondergaard. This is currently available to watch in the UK for free on Plex, and it's also available on the Internet Archive. And just be sure that you look for the 1939 version of the movie, and not the versions made in 1927, 1961, or 1978. We are then going to follow this with a Spanish movie called The Corruption of Chris Miller from 1973, and this was directed by Juan Antonio Bardem and stars Gene Seberg, Marisol, and Barry Stokes. This is actually a very hard film to track down unless you own a physical copy, but as of the time of recording, there is a copy available on YouTube and also one available on dailymotion.com, though I don't know how long they're going to be up for. So if you want to watch along, I would do it rather quickly. I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. So in the meantime, thank you once again for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.